hello, and welcome to our second History Hour podcast. This is Evan, Kris, Bethany, and Kaleb, your hosts.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. We're all members of the University of Maine Presque Isle History Club, and we are broadcasting from the WUPI 92.1 FM in Presque Isle. This is the show for all the curious and those attracted by history and fascinating stories. And on this episode of our podcast series, we will be discussing the event of the Aroostook War of 1838 to 1839. With us today, we also have a special guest, Kim Smith, from the Presque Isle Historical Society, where she will be joining us today to offer us some insights and details about the Aroostook War. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, and glad to be here.
So, Kim, we gathered today about the Aroostook War, and we'll go on a little bit later to talk about what is the Aroostook War in reality. So, can you give us a little bit about your experience and knowledge with the work both of the Historical Society, so our speakers can know more about you, and then also like your connection with the Aroostook War?
I have been with the Presque Isle Historical Society since 2006 and have been curating exhibits for them from almost the beginning. One of the exhibits was on the Aroostook War. In fact, it's one of the cornerstone exhibits out at our Maysville Museum. And anytime I do any exhibit or presentation, and we now have over 80 presentations that I have researched, I do lots and lots of in-depth research. So Aroostook War, as mentioned, is one of them. I have presented on that on several occasions to areas. I've been up to the University of Maine, Fort Kent, and I've done it here for SAGE, I believe, and some other audiences as well.
Great, yeah, and for those that don't know and they're listening to us for the first time, we are, of course, broadcasting from Presque Isle, and here in Presque Isle we also have a very great historical society that does a lot of activities, and they're operating the Maysville Museum as well, and other museums and exhibits throughout town. So to go into the topics, so let's talk about what is the Aroostook War, and what do we mean by Aroostook War. So the Aroostook War was, of course, a military and civilian confrontation that lasted from 1838 to 39 between the United States and the United Kingdom. There was no Canada back then yet. And the dispute was over the boundary from what we know today as the boundary of northern Maine, or Aroostook County in the detailed phase. So we had, and of course, it's called the Bloodless War, and you guys feel free to add any of that if you guys.
So, before we actually get in depth with the Aroostook War, we should probably talk about the cause of it, which was after the American Revolution. There was a little treaty called the Treaty of Paris, and they didn't really specify where the northern border of Maine was. So they all it said was, you can have the highlands, but they didn't really say what the highlands were. So, yeah.
And that's really important if you think about it. People do not realize that there was no border between what is now Maine and Canada established with the American Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it was a free land. It was no man's land, to be honest.
And add further to that the fact that Maine achieved statehood in 1820, and yet there was still no northern border in the state of Maine. There were 6 different votes to try to go to statehood, and they were getting everyone that they felt was in the state of Maine to vote on this. So they had people that felt they were in Canada essentially voting as to whether or not Maine was going to become a state. So this was really kind of a big conflict, much bigger than the war has ever really been credited with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially the voting part, in my opinion.
Yeah, a little bit.
So yeah, as Kris mentioned, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the American Revolution, of course, and did not specify the border, especially in this northern part of the United States, and at that part, Maine was not a state yet. since it achieved statehood in 1820. It was part of Massachusetts and the province of Maine. So when we talk about that, we have to understand that Maine, to backtrack a little bit, Massachusetts was actually selling lands and land grants while there was no established territory there yet. And based on my personal research that I've done, both Massachusetts and the state of Maine tried to sell as much land as possible they could up here in the Aroostook County so they can have a claim over the lands. And
we had something that was very important to everyone, and that was timber.
I was supposed to say it wasn't just Massachusetts. It was all over. It was all over New England, which is kind of funny. Imagining like people all the way from like Connecticut or whatever to coming up here and be like, "Hey, I want wood. Please give me wood."
And I mean, you do have tensions going between the residents of. I guess I'm gonna call it a border, the St. John River, but it wasn't a border yet. That will come after. But you do have people crossing the river back and forth and using the resources. For example, you have people from what is now New Brunswick and clearly supporting the Great Britain side coming over in this area and using the resources.
Well, timber back then was like gold today. You know, everything was made out of wood. All of your homes were made out of wood. All of businesses were built out of wood. And perhaps even more important, after a large war, your navy, your ships were built out of wood. And the tall masts on the ships came from the tall trees that we had here.
The pines, yeah.
In Maine, the trees back then were ginormous, like redwood level size. They were massive ancient trees, perfect for basically the entire ship. You could use parts of it for everything: the mast, the floorboards, some deck boards, whatever. Stuff like that was extremely valuable to both countries because Britain has to have a navy because it's an island. Without that, they're kind of screwed.
So we see Maine as a newly state that right from the beginning of its incorporation as a state, it has issues with the border because it's trying to define its boundaries. So you see a newly formed state having those problems. And besides all the other issues that they had as a newly state, now they have to deal with what are we going to do with Northern Maine. And especially getting close to 1838, of course, you have increasing tensions between the people that lived here because you... And I'm going to bring, and Kim can testify on that, the example of Arnold's cow here in the area of Presque Isle. So, Kim, you're going to talk to us a little bit about that now that makes sense with the timeline?
That's one of my favorite stories.
Awesome.
But I don't have my sidekick here to say E-I-E-I-O. So, even though there was no border established here, ownership established jurisdiction, in a sense. And you had people here who felt they were in Canada, and you had people here who felt they were in Maine. And we have a few communities that are really starting to grow. People are coming in, they're establishing farms, they're bringing in livestock, which was a very important commodity to the farmers. They protected that livestock with basically their lives because it was very costly and they had to use it for many things. And so there were two gentlemen in the Maysville area, which was the township between Presque Isle and Caribou, that were having a little bit of a spat over a cow. And one neighbor took the cow away from the other neighbor, and the neighbor took it back because he felt it was his cow. Mr. Arnold took it back, and Mr. McCrae went and did what others in the community thought was horrendous. He went and got the Canadian constable to come take this cow. And what ruffled the feathers of the other community members is they felt this was not Canada, and therefore the Canadian constable had no jurisdiction whatsoever. So 13 men, and these were the prominent men of Maysville and the names that most of us here would recognize now that have done some research, took up arms and went after this constable and his men. They caught him and the 5 men. They disarmed him. They took the cow back forcibly. Then they escorted these men to what they felt was the border and said, don't come back. So all of that over a cow. But that was not the only incident here in northern Maine that were increasing the tensions.
That was, that was one of the major ones, probably southern Aroostook.
Yes.
And then
central.
Central South, yeah. And then, of course, you have the Madawaska Pole, if I'm...
the Baker's Pole.
Baker's Pole, yeah, up in Madawaska in northern Maine. And want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. There was a gentleman by the name of Nathan Baker who had moved to the Madawaska area. And he firmly believed that he was in the United States. Same kind of concept. They got their mail by boat off the river. And on the 4th of July, he put up a flag on his property of the United States, and that highly incensed his neighbors. So it was kind of the opposite, because here it was they brought the Canadian constable in and it made the Americans mad, and there the American puts up the flag and it made the Canadians angry. So a little bit of the opposite, but that was the incident of Baker's flag.
It's weird that... I was just talking to one of my friends who's from the southern part of Maine, and I mentioned that we were going to do the Aroostook War today, and they're like, wait, what? I'm wondering, because it was such a big part in our history, I wonder why people don't really know about it. Do you have any theories on that?
Well, I kind of alluded to that earlier when I said the Aroostook War didn't really get the credit for what it was. And I wish I had an answer for that. Even growing up here and going to high school here, I never heard about the Aroostook War at the time. Yeah. So I wish I had an answer for that. I wish I could explain it. I wish I could fix it, but...
And that is, another issue where this podcast is talking about the Aroostook War, because there's nothing out there about it. So, great. So you have these incidents, you have these issues, these rising tensions in this area about claiming lands for either the United States, which it was Maine now, we up to 1820s, or either the Great Britain side. And... So you have people jumping back and forth, cutting timber, having these conflicts. And that is the point when, if I'm correct, 1839, the Maine legislature authorized the new governor, John Fairfield, to send a land agent, Rufus McIntyre, okay, I totally messed that up. And that's the thing where the whole game starts, right? So that agent, I'm going to give it in very simple words. So the agent comes up here, tries to do some surveys. Then he gets kidnapped by the Great Britain side. Then there were some tensions again. And then our side, I think, kidnaps their land agent because you took ours. We're going to take yours back. So, and that's, I think, the rising, the top incident. And if I'm not sure if I have that right. So the soldiers, because we do have a mobilization of military in this area, and that's how the roads got started as well. So were the soldiers here in the area before the kidnapping took place, or did they arrive after that?
Well, you had the troop buildup that began in about 1839. Colonel Charles Jarvis was appointed to take over as land agent under the Governor Fairfield, and he was actually headquartered in Fort Fairfield. He had troops in Masardis, he had troops in Ashland, and along the roads that you had mentioned were being built at the time, there were about 750 troops in the area. Now, whether they came from this area or were brought in, I don't know. They did bring an additional 1,000 men in later. And you mentioned that was building the roads, but that's also where we got the forts.
Yep.
So we have Fort Fairfield. The blockhouse there is a reproduction. We have Fort Kent. That is the original blockhouse. So we had those two that were built to protect the area, and then there were also 2 in Canada that were built to protect the area. You had the one in Petit-Sault, and you had the one over in Cabano, Quebec. So those 4 were the forts that were built to house those troops and to protect the borders as they saw them. There was about 12,000 acres actually in dispute at the time. And to put it in a perspective of someone who's looking at a map to figure this out, if the what's now the Canadians had gotten their way, Maine would have ended at Mars Hill. Maine felt the border went much, much further. And so the border that we have now was actually a negotiation and...
In the middle, yeah.
Right.
Because if I remember the map, the Maine claim, I think, reached almost...
like to the St. John.
Yeah, it reached all the way north to the St. John, so... And that, of course, was a bit too much from the other side, I think, as if that was the case, then you split what's today New Brunswick from Quebec. There is no connection between the two.
Yeah, and they desperately needed that river in the wintertime.
Yeah, if
that communication route between the two.
If that was the case, yeah.
Supplies.
Yeah, so we do have that, and again, you do have some militia coming here, and I think the total amount, and of course you have military coming from southern Maine, and they stayed in Bangor, I believe, and then they moved up here. They moved all the way to the border to protect and build those forts. They actually used settlers that were here to help them build the roads themselves. So some of the roads that we have even today are from that area.
Well, and you had a presence in Holton as well. They didn't necessarily have a fort, but that is where the armaments were being held. And I don't know how well you know Holton, but there is Military Street, and that's exactly where it came from.
From that time, yeah. So I think, so the United States side had about 6,000 troops, I believe, at that time. And then you have the United Kingdom and the British North American side with 15,000. So you see a clear difference on the strengths there. And I know, Kaleb, you found some great information that I didn't even know about. So if you want to give us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The government, because of the rising tensions, actually, the Congress actually authorized, I believe it was 50,000 extra troops and $10 million to this cause, because a matter like this really is cutting one of our states in half, or cutting one of our states a major amount of land, which of course we took seriously. However, they encouraged the president, if possible, to find a peaceful solution, because they don't want us, basically, an epilogue to the Revolutionary War. We don't want to have another fight with Britain that we'd have to win.
And nothing happens in a vacuum. You have to realize what else is going on in the United States at the same time. So you have states being admitted to the Union, and we already can see the rising tension within the states themselves over the issue of slavery. So as states are being admitted, well, this one can be admitted because they're not a slave state. This one can be admitted because they are a slave state, and they tried to balance out. So if our state gets dissected, how does that affect it? You know, it's very possible that it could.
And also, this was like not that far away from the War of 1812, so I assume that the American people didn't really want another war with Britain. Not that much. And also, I don't know what I was gonna say.
Yeah, well, I'll just jump in. So, on February 15th, 1839, you have the Maine legislature authorized militia, about 1,000 additional volunteers, to post them on the upper Aroostook River to supply more soldiers to those forts and encampments that we talked about. And at the same time, there was additional correspondence from New Brunswick. And the interesting thing here is that there was British Army troops arriving here from the West Indies, coming here to supply that conflict in the border. And so you do have the gathering of the military. The tensions, I think, were so... People thought that a war was going to break out. So there was a great deal of conflict, even if we don't see it like that, because it is the Bloodless War at the end. So there wasn't like an official war, but there were other tensions.
Right. And to bring in some more of those outside politics, because this all played a part of it, you also have the role of the Acadians in this. And the Acadians, they wanted to ally with the United States. They had a problem as far as declarations of allegiance with, France and with the United Kingdom, and with the Micmacs having converted to Catholicism. They also identified with the French. So that is all pushing towards the United States side of this. So there's all these outside factors playing in, which it's really a very fascinating war to study because of all these things going on in the country at the time. And then you have little side notes that have nothing really to do with military strategy. Did you know that there was an Aroostook War fight song?
Oh, really?
Yes,
No.
and it was to the tune of Old Lang Syne, and there's like 10 verses. It's this great big long song, and they called it the Bloodless War, but there was a death down in Haynesville.
Yep.
And for those who are from Maine, especially those who are from southern Aroostook, you hear Haynesville and you already start thinking ghost stories because there's
creepy
all
road,
kinds
yeah.
of ghost stories on that road.
Yep.
And that's where the grave is, right along that road.
Oh, wow.
And you can actually see it from the road. And there's all these theories as to how he actually died. And there's I think 7 different theories at the latest count. He died from the flu. He died from being shot, which he didn't. He died from being run over by a horse and wagon. He drowned, which would be kind of hard because there's no lake right there. And so all of these interesting theories, and I don't know if anyone will ever really know the truth, but it just adds to that whole mystique of Haynesville,
I mean, he might have drowned in his bath. I don't know. Maybe.
This is the 1800s. Baths?
I'm gonna
Chris.
go with drown just because the story there could be so funny.
Yeah.
That is true. That
Just
is
staring
true.
straight up in
Just
the
so
rain.
he's not anonymous, his name was Private Hiram Smith. No relation, but
Okay. That's funny. Yeah. So we do have, and that was one of the deaths up here. And there were some other people, the soldiers that died in Bangor from sickness, and of course from the Great Britain side.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Soldier's Pond? Soldier's Pond, isn't that someone died there?
there is a soldier's pond, and that's one of the places that the story says he may have drowned, but Soldier's Pond is north. It's not.
Oh, okay.
Down there.
'cause The information that I read was then completely wrong. Then just cut that out.
Yeah. Well.
Walk back.
Nope.
So a very great details in this war, and it was from 1838, 39, the official ending, and then you have in 42, of course, the sign of the treaty, which we will talk later about. So what happened? So we have all these people coming in, and here I want to point another story that Kim, of course, knows. It's and I have my notes here. So the story is the red skirt on the bear.
Oh, yes,
You remember that, Kim?
I do. You tell it. You tell it so well.
I'll give the story. So, so in the pioneer days, the settlers' cows, were roaming free. There was no fences, so each family had their cows, and they were all running around the area. So one night, Polly Armstrong, which was one of the wives of the first pioneer in this area, went out to get the cows back into the barn or her farm. So her husband was not there in the house, and she was all alone. So she gathers some of the cows, she counts them up, and I think she found one missing. So she went out to go find that cow. On her way to find that cow, she encounters a bear. And of course, the bears do that, chased Mrs. Armstrong, and she found a refuge on top of a tree. And the bear, of course, was below the tree trying to get to her, and she was on top of the tree screaming probably. And at that moment, somehow she takes off her cape or her shirt, something that she wore at the time.
Shawl.
And it was the color of red. So she takes her red cape or shirt and she throws it on the bear, and somehow that gets stuck on the bear, and the bear, of course, scared, runs away, and of course she ran away. It probably was over her face, and she got scared. She ran away, and a few hours later, I think the bear just walks or runs, still with the cape on her back or on her head, and some American soldiers happened to patrol that area at that time when the bear was passing. So, of course, the American soldiers, they see something running in distance wearing a red cape, so they thought it was a British soldier. So the story goes that they shoot down the bear, and that was one of the biggest losses of the war.
I wish the last time I had encountered a bear, it had been wearing red. I might have seen it before I totaled my car.
I can't even imagine that, like having a bear just run with a red thing on her back. And that might be a myth, but that might be true. I mean, you never know with history.
I do really hope it's true.
I hope so too, Kris.
I really,
of her
really
to
do.
be wearing such a color in such that time.
So yeah, we do have all of these stories. And so we're going to move on and talk about the event itself now that we explained it a little bit more. So with the coming of the Ashburton Treaty now, so you have the tensions, you have the forts, the military being on both sides, ready to start a war probably, and then at the end of that big tension, you have the kidnapping. So the kidnapping came, I think, caused a great deal of fear and of tensions and getting scared that the war is actually gonna happen now because of those kidnappings. So I think what happened was that delegations from both sides decided to, okay, we're gonna try to end this. This is ridiculous. Let's try to find something so we don't start another war. Because let's not forget that the Revolutionary War was not too far back. So we're talking about delegations from Washington, D.C., I believe, and from the Great Britain side, settling that issue and releasing the captives, the two land agents. And so after that, what's happening after they got released? Is that when in a few years the treaty comes into place, or?
Well, the treaty came in August of 1842. I don't know the actual dates on the kidnapping. So.
The site I found was the 21st day. Oh, the kidnapping or the treaty? Which one are you talking about?
The treaty was in 42.
Yeah.
So she's asking when was the kidnapping, and the kidnapping, okay. I believe was 1839. I believe so.
That's what I read.
I believe it was 1839 because after I think the kidnappings, there was a few months, and then the soldiers, of course, left the area because there was no tensions anymore. They signed an unofficial treaty on that before the official treaty came into place.
Right, and they brought in some big guns for the treaty. It's not like some of the others, like during the Civil War, you just had the generals kind of sit down and write out a surrender. This was Daniel Webster, who was the U.S. Secretary of State. I mean, that says a lot about how important this war was to me. They bring in the U.S. Secretary of State to do the negotiations. And on the other side of the coin was Alexander Baring, who was the first Baron Ashburton of Great Britain. And there was a pretty big compromise here. They gave 7,015 square miles to Maine, and they gave 5,012 square miles to Great Britain. The British kept the northern area, and that really assured them that they had overland military communications with Montreal, which was important to them. And Webster used a map as he was laying out the border that was supposedly, I like this part too, that was supposedly marked with a red line by Benjamin Franklin when he was in Paris in 1782.
Oh, wow.
And he used that map to persuade Maine and Massachusetts to accept the agreement. And Britain agreed to pay the states $150,000 each. And they were reimbursed by the United States for those expenses. So the treaty was ratified in the United States in 1842, but it didn't get ratified in Great Britain until the year after that. But that officially ended the border dispute. That lasted, if you think about it, for more than half a century.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, their real issue was there a long time ago, and the border, of course, was what established the main boundaries today. What the state looks like today, it's because of that treaty, and it's really important to know that, because that has to do with our future and our present, and it comes from our past.
And Kris made a really good point earlier when he was talking about some of the wording in the earlier treaties, and that was really part of the problem. It was semantics, because they were saying, well, the border is on the highlands. Well, what's the highlands? No one had defined what the highlands were. And so I think it was pretty smart of Daniel Webster to pull out that map and say, here, this is where the border is going to be. So rather than use words that people can disagree as to what those words might mean, he actually had
Imagery.
a picture.
He got proof, yeah. And I think when the border was established, I think that's when Aroostook County was established as well, right?
Aroostook County came later. It was actually formed out of Penobscot and Washington counties.
And of course was... So the state felt more safe now because there was an official border. Because I believe people, even from all the areas of the states or even southern Maine, did not want to move into an area that they did not know if one day I'm going to be American or the other day I'm going to be British.
Well, it's funny. They say history repeats itself. And the one recurring theme that we have here in Maine is there's always been two Maines. And that's been since day one. So before we ever have a state of Maine, we have, are we Maine or are we Canada, right? So
North
we have two
Massachusetts
Maines right
South
there.
Canada.
And then as we're trying to achieve statehood, you had a disagreement going on between the towns on the coast and the towns that had been established just off the coast. So they felt that even back then that was two Maines. And then today you hear that a lot between southern Maine and northern Maine, because we are so completely different industry-wise and population-wise. So it's just been a recurring theme.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, of course, you see that if you go talk to somebody from Madawaska, for example. One of my friends is from Madawaska, and go talk to somebody from Portland. I think there was a joke going around that people from Portland didn't even know what Presque Isle was or something. Yeah, what Aroostook County was. So I think it's really funny. And and you have that security now with the border. Now it's established. It's 1842. We have a border. Now we can sell land to people of interest that want to come and settle in this country. And you do have a push from the states for the establishment of townships in northern Maine after that treaty was established because of that security. And before we move on, I know Kaleb had a funny, a very interesting find about General Lee. Did he arrive here?
He did actually. Let me just pull it up. Basically, in 1839,
which goes back 2 years before the treaty. Yeah.
If I can just hit the button. Basically, the Hancock U.S. Army Barracks during the conflict, or the response to it, that barracks got established. And by 1831, a military road was complete between Mattawamkeag and Holton, paving the way for additional immigration north. For a brief period, Robert E. Lee served as an engineer on a surveying mission at Hancock Barracks. So basically, before the Civil War even happened, Lee still had a job.
Well, he was West Point. He was a West Point graduate, and that was a big decision for him to leave West Point in the north and go back to the south where he was originally from. But
yeah, I think
kind of interesting. I never knew that part.
Me neither. Yeah, he came today with his research, and I'm like, wow.
Actually, as a side note, Robert E. Lee honestly didn't agree with slavery that much. He wasn't fighting for slavery as much as he was fighting for his home, Virginia. Yeah, he was fighting more for that than slavery. He actually didn't like slavery all that much.
Well, and a lot of people feel that was the primary purpose of the Civil War. And I don't know as I would agree with that, because a lot of it was about preserving your way of life. If the South had won the war, because why would people from Presque Isle, Maine go fight in the Civil War. And
Fair
it made
point,
a
yeah.
huge impact here. You know, we had half of the men leave to go fight, and that put a huge burden on the rest of the population because they now had to step into traditionally male roles. But the reason was to preserve a way of life, because if the South had won, our economy and politics would be completely different than what they are now. So I don't know if you can separate those two things, the slavery and the way of life, because they kind of fed off each other, but it wasn't necessarily slavery that they were fighting over.
Yeah, and that's a big topic, of course. Yeah,
And we totally digressed, but
but it's okay. Maybe next next podcast we can talk about the Civil War. But at this point, we would like to thank WUPI 92.1 FM for hosting our podcast, and we wanted to let you know that WUPI is now available on TuneIn, and we also highly encourage you to like their page on Facebook and Instagram. Also, our podcast is now available on SoundCloud, and you can find us by searching History Hour Podcast. So we kind of went over, and we started from the beginning of what was the cause of the war, what happened during the middle part, and then what happened with the treaty, the Webster-Ashburn Treaty. So I wanted to bring up the issue of, so what was the impact of the war for the state? And I want to also touch upon the Acadian side, because we know that because of that treaty, families get separated in the border. And you have families, Acadian families from one side cannot see their families on the other side because now they're into different countries. So let's talk a little bit about and discuss the impacts of the war for the state of Maine.
well, and I don't think it's just Acadian families that were separated. You know, my family is originally from the Hodgdon area, just south of Holton, and I remember visiting here as a child and going up Westford Hill to pick apples, and before we knew it, we were in Canada, but we didn't think anything of it because the border wasn't like it is today, and we had relatives over there, you know, and it's the same today. You go across the border to visit your relatives, and it's not just the Acadians that are doing that. So it did have a huge impact because you were separating families. And I think it perhaps even more pronounced today because the border is so much more distinct and it makes it so much harder to cross over. So it is harder to get to see your relatives than it was back then. But that was a huge part of it.
And
So
sorry to interrupt, but to play off what Kim said, it also had a huge impact on the Indigenous communities that were here. It really separated who was Canadian, who was able to cross borders, and that kind of thing.
And that issue still is ongoing today.
Yeah, still today, yeah.
that's a great point. Yeah, I didn't think much about that, but yeah, I can't believe how the indigenous communities will, because they did not have a border to begin with. They did
Right.
not have a distinction, so now they have a distinction officially, which it might have
Right.
been a great.
And they have a sovereign card that is supposed to allow them to cross without any issues, but
Right.
that's not necessarily
Yeah,
what's
the
happening
US,
in practice.
If you're Indigenous born in America, you have automatic, recognized by the USA, automatic citizenship in both the US and Canada. But if you're born in Canada, under the Brits, you're just Canadian, you're not American. So it really caused a lot of tensions between the Indigenous communities.
That's interesting, yeah, and again, so it's good for the state, but not necessarily for the people that are living on the border. If that's what I guess our consensus. And again, it's good for the state again because now they have the security of selling land, and I think that helped a lot, especially back then. The Maine was trying to establish itself, but going back to the Acadians again, and of course it wasn't just Acadians. Anybody that lived on the border. One of my friends, he's Acadian, and he keeps bringing up the point that it was kind of a big deal for them specifically. Because, and as you mentioned, I didn't know that they did favor the American side. But with that border, you have that distinction of that separation of families and whatsoever, yeah.
Well, and then when you had the great migration of them being forced out of Canada, and of course that was a totally different era, but and
Yeah.
then going down to Louisiana, you had even more separation of families. But
They keep separating every time, but that's a story for another time. So, anything else on that topic? Any funny story? Maybe any interesting story? Because I think we covered a little bit more about
Other
it.
than the effects are still seen today, it's definitely like if you come from southern Maine, and you know, like what the point we said earlier, like people don't realize that like there's two separate Maines. It's definitely a culture shock when you go up into the valley because, as they say, because it's totally different. It's like you're in another world. So
On the top of that, me being from central southern Maine, when I came up here during a class once, they're like, so they said something about Harvest Week or something like that, and I'm like, what's Harvest Week? Because in southern central Maine, they don't really have that, and I didn't know what it was, and I talked to someone about it, and they're like, well, people get 1 to 2 weeks off to go and farm.
help their families
Yeah.
pick potatoes. Yeah.
And I'm like, really? Huh. Well, I mean, it makes more sense now that I know about the county. I mean, this place is riddled with potato fields, so I imagine that they would have to have time to help their families. when they're
My favorite statistic for you, Kris, right? Maine produces 4% of the national potato crop, and Aroostook County produces 96% of that. So I can't believe you haven't learned to quote that fact from me yet.
Yeah.
I have two
Haven't
little
looked at it.
ironies for you about the Aroostook War.
Sure.
So we've talked about the fact that the Aroostook War had a lot to do with the fact that this part of the state was timber rich, and we were fighting for our timber. It was such a huge commodity, and they signed the treaty, and Fort Fairfield sold their lumber rights to a New Brunswick company. So that one cracks me up. And then
So what's the
here's-
point of the war, right?
Right. So now here's another one. John Baker, right, of our Madawaska
Madawaska,
Liberty
yeah.
Pole issue. He had always been a staunch supporter of Maine landowners. He passed away in 1868, and when the boundary line was finalized on the treaty, his property actually ended up being in New Brunswick, and he is buried, or was buried, in New Brunswick. But in 1895, knowing that he was such a staunch Maine supporter, right, they dug him up and moved him and brought him back over here to Fort Fairfield and buried him on Maine soil.
That is ridiculous.
That's incredible.
Do you know who finally recognized that? Oh, this United States supporters should probably be buried in the United States.
Some Canadians like, wait, why is this guy here? He didn't like us.
Yeah, get him out of here.
Get away from here.
That's funny. That's funny. I didn't know that. So his property was on the other side. Wow. That's great. And
America, actually, you're in Canada. Wait, what?
Excuse me.
and another thing that I think is really funny, and maybe Kim can give us more information about it. So why is it called by some the Pork and Beans War?
Because that's all they had to eat.
Oh, okay. Guys, I do see the name a lot, but it's not like the official name. It's kind of like a nickname for the war. So they only have pork and beans. Cool.
That makes sense.
I mean, it's better than what the soldiers in the American Revolution had, but
That's a fair point.
The only other thing I can think of to bring up is that I found an interesting fact was just the Battle of Caribou, where it's just two groups of lumberjacks who were armed, but they didn't do anything to each other. So
And you do have those, I mean,
Yeah.
along the way from everywhere. But yeah, there was like a battle in Caribou. Battle
Just an
in
aggression.
quotation marks.
Basically, just an insult battle for a couple days.
but the aggression of Caribou doesn't really have that ring to it, so they have to call it the Battle of Caribou because that sounds better.
Yeah. And
Politics.
Well, the incident of Arnold's cow was also known as the Aroostook Riot.
different names to very interesting stories from what I see here. So, for everybody who's listening, I know the Historical Society is having some exhibits in the Maysville Museum about the Aroostook War. So if you're interested to learn more, please visit the Maysville Museum. It's a great area, and I really like it there. And
Thank you.
I
Yes,
go-
visit our website, pihistory.org. You can find out more about the Maysville Museum, when it's open, the new exhibits coming this year, and all kinds of fun things.
what's the new exhibit about?
We have a new exhibit this year called Quilts, the Fabric of Life. And we will have some of our antique quilts on display. Some of them go all the way back to like the mid 1800s. And we added kind of an interesting twist to that. The 8th grade students here at the middle school have a poetry module every year. And I approached the poetry instructor and asked if she would be interested in having the kids write poems about our quilts.
Oh, wow.
And I have to say, I was extremely impressed.
That's awesome, yeah.
That is awesome.
So yeah, please visit the Maysville Museum and the Historical Society. And if you're not from Aroostook County, visit Aroostook County, because
That's right. It's a great place.
You get
exactly.
the best potatoes ever.
I am not from Aroostook County, but I love this place so much. So, well, that's all for today's episode of the History Hour. Thanks for listening, and thank you to Kim Smith for joining us today and
My
sharing
pleasure.
her ideas and knowledge about the Aroostook War. And join us again next week when we talk about the history of zombies in American culture. And make sure you tune in to WUPI 92.1 FM next Saturday at 4 p.m. so you never miss an episode. Also, for previous or future episodes of the History Hour podcast, make sure you search History Hour Podcast in SoundCloud. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Peace.
Bye.